Oak Creek Memorial in Norfolk smells like antiseptic and floor wax, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like distant machinery, the kind of sound that becomes white noise after your first shift and never quite stops after that. Katie Morrison pushes a medication cart down the pale green hallway at 6:13 a.m., her movements economical and precise, each step deliberate, her scrubs the color of institutional gray that makes her blend into the walls like camouflage. She's been invisible for 3 years. It's the safest way to survive. The break room at 7:15 a.m. is where the real hospital lives, where nurses actually talk, where conversations flow like blood through capillaries, where the unofficial hierarchy gets sorted by who sits where and whose opinion matters. Katie enters, sees the cluster of staff gathered around the corner table, and instead of joining them, she moves to the far counter and pours coffee that's been sitting since 6 a.m., the surface filmed with that thick residue that comes from hours of oxidation. Nobody acknowledges her? She's learned that this is the deal she made, safety in exchange for solitude. "Did you see the census numbers?" a nurse named Jennifer asks the table, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who's been at Oak Creek for 8 years. 17 admits yesterday. Trauma Bay was running like a machine. Sterling's already on his way up, another voice says, Marcus, one of the day shift residents, checking his watch like it's a ticking bomb. He'll want rounds at 8:30 sharp. You know how he gets about protocol. Katie stirs sugar into her coffee. 1 spoon. The same every morning. She's sitting at the far corner of the counter, her body angled away from the group, her left forearm pressing against the cold laminate surface. Long sleeves even in June, people stopped asking about that after the first month. The scars underneath are thin, pale, webbed like frost patterns on a window. They tell stories she stopped telling a long time ago. She takes a sip. The coffee is bitter. Everything here is bitter. Sterling dressed down Chen yesterday about the medication reconciliation. Jennifer continues, her tone shifting to something that resembles gossip. Said Chen's documentation was substandard for a teaching hospital. You know how he gets. Like we're all working below some invisible standard he set the day he arrived. Katie's right hand trembles slightly as she raises the cup to her lips. She forces the tremor to stop, presses her palm flat against the counter, counts to 5 in her head, the same technique she used in Helmand Province, the same thing that kept her hand steady when they were hauling wounded through rubble and shrapnel and the sound of rounds snapping past her head. But that was a different life. That was someone else. The group at the table laughs at something. Jennifer's laugh is sharp, cutting. Nobody's looking at Katie. Nobody ever does. At 7:16 a.m., during the transition between night shift and day shift, Katie finds herself in the supply room restocking dressing trays. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead, one tube is dying, strobing intermittently, and nobody's bothered to change it yet. She arranges sterile gauze pads with the same focus she used to apply to equipment checks, each motion muscle memory wrapped in hospital routine. Her fingers are steady here, in the quiet. In the quiet, she remembers who she is. In the quiet, she's not pretending. Dr. Sterling arrives on the unit at 8:22 a.m., and the entire energy shifts like pressure dropping before a storm. Katie hears him before she sees him, his voice carries with that particular resonance of someone accustomed to being heard without having to raise his volume. His Italian loafers click against the linoleum with a rhythm that's almost rhythmic, approaching footsteps she learned to recognize in a different context, in a different country, in a different life where things made sense. She's in the supply alcove when he passes, and her body goes still without her willing it to. Professional training, muscle memory, the instinct that kept her alive when stillness meant survival. His cologne arrives first, something expensive, something that smells like money and privilege and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested. He's flanked by 2 residents who move like satellites orbiting a sun that's convinced it's the center of the universe. He's discussing something about hospital excellence standards and the importance of maintaining appropriate professional boundaries and ensuring we're not attracting the wrong kind of attention from administration. Katie watches him from the supply alcove. He's 48, maybe 50, with the kind of face that comes from good genetics and better skin care, grey threading through his dark hair like someone touched him with silver. His hands are uncalloused. She notices hands first. It's a habit she can't break. His hands have never held anyone's weight while they bled out. His hands have never felt the tremor of a body going into shock. His hands have only ever held clipboards and pens and the kind of authority that gets granted by institutions instead of earned through consequence. She touches her left forearm through the sleeve of her scrubs. The scars are still there. They never stop being there. At 8:45 a.m., the shift huddle happens in the conference room. Katie sits in the back row, against the wall, with a clear line of sight to the door. She takes notes in a small spiral notebook, vital signs, pending labs, medication reconciliation tasks, and nobody would know she's absorbing every clinical detail with the focus of someone whose competence has never been questioned, only never acknowledged. Dr. Sterling stands at the front with a cup of coffee that's probably fresh, probably from the Nespresso machine he convinced administration to install in the physician's lounge, and he reviews the day's admissions. Room 304, he says. Pneumonia, community acquired, stable. Standard protocol. Room 308, he continues. Post-op knee replacement, pain management tracking appropriately. His voice moves through the rooms like he's reading a menu. Each one a checkbox. Each one a task. He never connects them to the fact that there are people in those rooms, people with histories, with fears, with the particular vulnerability that comes from lying in a hospital bed and trusting strangers with your life. Room 312, he says, and Katie's coffee cup stops halfway to her lips. Admits this morning. Deaf patient, previous trauma history, already assigned nursing care. Standard intake procedures. The words just fall out of his mouth like they're nothing. But Katie's hands are beginning to shake again. She sets the coffee cup down carefully so nobody notices. In the fluorescent light, she can see the slight tremor in her fingers. She presses her hands flat against her thighs. She counts to 5 again. And then she excuses herself with a nod and a quiet exit, nobody really registering her departure, and she walks down the hallway toward room 312 like she's being drawn on a leash. She doesn't know why. She tells herself it doesn't matter. She tells herself that acknowledging room 312, acknowledging what's happening there, will only make everything harder. But her feet are already moving, already taking her toward the room at the end of the east corridor, and her breathing is starting to change, getting shallower, and the fluorescent lights overhead suddenly seem too bright and too loud and too present. The door to room 312 is partially open. She can see a portion of the bed from the hallway, and there's a pair of boots on the floor beside it. Combat boots. The kind of boots that have walked through desert heat and mountain terrain, and the kind of mud that only exists in places where the government doesn't advertise on television. The leather is worn through in specific places, scuffed at the heel, creased at the toe where someone has walked thousands of miles, the laces frayed and dirty and real. Katie's breath catches in her throat. She stops moving. For a moment, she's not in Norfolk. She's in Helmand Province in 2004, and she's part of a Special Forces extraction team, and there's a kid, a boy, maybe 14, 15, buried in rubble after an airstrike that wasn't supposed to happen in that village. She's pulling him out of the dust, her hand steady, her voice calm, her training overriding everything else, and she's seeing his eyes go wide with shock and relief and the particular terror that comes from thinking you're dead and then suddenly discovering you're not. She stares at those boots for 17 seconds. Her hands begin to tremble. She forces them to stop, forces herself to turn away, forces herself to walk back down the hallway toward the medication dispensary like nothing has happened. Like her past has just been sitting here in Norfolk the entire time, waiting in a hospital room with worn combat boots placed beside the bed like a talisman. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the moment her brain caught up to what her instincts already knew: the boy from Helmand had survived, and he'd found his way here, to this hospital, to this room, to this moment where she'd have to make a choice between staying invisible and stepping forward into the light. The medication dispensary is cool and quiet and sterile, locked behind a combination that only nursing staff can access. Katie enters the code, her birthday, which nobody here knows, and she leans against the pharmaceutical refrigerator and lets her hands shake for exactly 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds. That's all she allows herself. Then she closes her fists, straightens her spine, smooths her scrubs, and walks back out into the fluorescent light. At 9:15 a.m., Dr. Sterling is holding court in the hallway with his entourage, discussing something about maintaining appropriate standards and ensuring professional boundaries, and Katie moves past them with a medication tray, her head down, her movements invisible, her voice non-existent. He glances at her, just a glance, the kind you give to background objects, to furniture that happens to walk, and returns to his conversation without acknowledgement. She's learned that invisibility is a survival strategy. She's learned that staying quiet keeps you safe. She's learned that the past stays buried as long as you keep your mouth shut and your eyes down and your hand steady even when everything inside you is starting to shake apart. She's learned all of this very, very well. Dr. Hayes emerged from room 312 with his clipboard already turning away, his voice clipped and final. Communication barriers. Too much liability. Get an interpreter if this is critical. He didn't wait for questions. The hallway absorbed his footsteps like it swallowed everyone else's certainty. Katie watched from the medication station, her hand steady as she counted syringes. The deaf veteran's oxygen was 94%. Still acceptable. Still time. Dr. Patel was next, his white coat catching the fluorescent light as he glanced at the patient's chart. We don't have certified interpreters on staff. You can't obtain informed consent without proper communication protocols. Hospital policy. He handed the clipboard to the nurse station attendant without looking at the family gathered outside room 312. The wife's shoulders had already begun to curve inward. Chen refused with apologies that meant nothing. Rodriguez with a reference to staffing constraints. Kim with a recommendation to contact a larger facility better equipped for special needs cases. Walsh with a shrug that said everything about how little he cared. 5 refusals. The oxygen monitor outside room 312 beeped. 89% now. The numbers were dropping like stones. Katie's jaw tightened. Not a tremble. Not a flinch. Just the simple physics of muscle responding to information the body had learned long ago in Helmand Province. When resources ran short and the clock became a weapon, the person standing closest to the problem became responsible for solving it. That was not policy. That was survival. Then Dr. Sterling himself emerged from his office at the far end of the corridor, his presence moving through the unit like displaced air, like pressure changes in a room before a storm. He was tall enough that even at 30 feet, his silhouette dominated the hallway. His shoes were Italian leather, burnished to a shine that suggested someone else maintained them. His voice, when he spoke to the gathered nurses and aides, carried the measured disdain of someone who had never once questioned whether his refusals mattered. This facility cannot accommodate every special needs case that walks through our doors. He said it loud enough for the entire unit to hear. Loud enough for the patient's wife and teenage daughter visible through the doorway glass to understand that their son, their family member, was being categorized as a special needs case. A problem. An inconvenient wrapped in skin and genetics. Katie moved forward before the next breath completed. Her voice came out steady, not soft, not defiant, just functional like a tool being placed on a counter. I can communicate with him. I'll take his case. Sterling's head turned with the precision of a predator registering movement. His eyes found her across the fluorescent distance, and something in his expression shifted, a recalibration, a sudden awareness that someone had just stepped outside the acceptable boundaries of the hierarchy he'd spent 15 years constructing at Oak Creek Memorial. He walked toward her. Not quickly. The slowness was worse. The slowness said he had all the time in the world to handle this problem, and his time was worth more than anyone else's. Nurse Morrison, or should I call you St. Katie? His smile contained no warmth. His voice had dropped into a register that made the unit go quiet, the way rooms go quiet before something breaks. This requires physician-level assessment. You've overstepped nursing boundaries, which seems to be a pattern with you. He said it in front of the wife and daughter. He said it loud enough for the break room staff to hear it through the open doorway. He said it the way you'd speak about someone who didn't understand her place, who kept reaching for things beyond her authority, who needed to be reminded, publicly, visibly, with witnesses, exactly where she stood in the institutional architecture. Katie's composure didn't crack. The trembling wasn't fear. It was something older. Something learned in a country where silence was sometimes the only negotiation available. Her eyes met his and held, and she said nothing back because the moment for words had already passed. Sterling turned away, satisfied. He returned to his office, and his door closed with a sound like punctuation. 20 minutes later, his handwriting appeared on a formal warning notice, hospital letterhead, his signature, documentation of her boundary violation. He walked personally to the unit break room and pinned it to the corkboard where every staff member would see it during their shifts. The warning stayed there. Visible. Permanent. A public record of her failure to stay in her assigned lane. 1 hour later, Katie sat down at the break room table with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm in her hands and a sandwich she didn't taste. There were 8 seats at the table. She occupied one. 3 nurses, Mariah from nights, Sophia from the pediatric rotation, and Jackson from surgical, grabbed their half-eaten sandwiches and left without looking at her. Their movements were simultaneous, coordinated, as if Sterling's warning had come with an instruction manual about how to handle contamination. Another nurse, someone Katie had helped through a difficult shift 6 weeks ago, poured her coffee down the sink rather than sit beside Katie. The coffee made a sound like surrender as it swirled into the drain. The fluorescent lights above the break room hummed their mechanical song, indifferent. By 1:15 p.m., Katie sat alone at a table designed for 8. The space around her had become something else, not empty, but deliberately vacated. The distinction mattered. Emptiness could be circumstantial. This was intentional. This was institutional. This was what happened when you stepped outside the boundaries that kept the machinery running smoothly. She sat there for 23 minutes, finishing nothing, touching almost nothing, her hand steady on the table in front of her. Hands that had held lives together in places that would never be named in hospital records. Hands that had learned to work without talking because sometimes the noise of communication was a luxury you couldn't afford. Those hands didn't shake now, though part of her, the part that had learned to recognize what things cost, understood that they should. Sterling found her near the medication room that evening, his timing too precise to be coincidental. He'd been waiting, or looking, or planning this particular conversation with the kind of care most people reserved for important business. His voice came soft now, which was somehow worse than the public announcement. Here's what happens to nurses who forget their place, St. Katie. They find themselves very, very alone. No references. No future positions. No career. He said it the way you describe the mechanics of something inevitable, like gravity or infection rates. Not as a threat. As information. Katie took one measured breath. The kind of breath that soldiers learned to take before bad things happened, when preparation was the only option available and preparation meant controlling the one thing you could still control, your own body's response to pressure. She met his eyes. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. A single tear traced her cheek, not from breaking, but from the sheer accumulated weight of 20 years of burial, of silence, of watching lives fall apart inside a uniform you couldn't take off. She wiped it without looking away. Without flinching. Without giving him anything except the simple statement of someone who'd already learned that some costs couldn't be negotiated. Those boots survived more firefights than you've seen patients, Doctor. Sterling's jaw tightened. His composure didn't break, but something in his expression hardened like concrete setting, the recognition that he was facing something his institutional power couldn't touch, something that had already survived things far worse than his warnings could inflict. The trembling wasn't hers. The trembling, if it had existed at all, would have been his, the subtle seismic activity of a man suddenly aware that the person standing in front of him wasn't a nurse who'd overstepped boundaries. She was something else entirely. What happened next began in darkness, began with a choice, began with the sound of a door closing behind her as she entered room 312, where oxygen monitors beeped their declining numbers and a deaf veteran waited with the same defiant expression he'd worn as a boy pulled from rubble 2 decades ago in a province whose name Katie never spoke anymore. But that wasn't the worst part, not for Sterling. The worst part came later, when her choice to step into that room triggered a cascade he never saw coming. That evening, Katie stood at Marcus's grave in the rain, water streaming down her face as she whispered to the headstone weathered grey by 5 winters of coastal storms. "I failed again," she said, her voice barely audible beneath the drumming downpour. "I saved him twice and they're making me walk away." The rain hammered harder, as if the sky itself was answering. This was how it always ended, wasn't it? The good people fired. The right choice punished. The silence that followed her confession lasted so long that a cardinal landed on the marble edge, shook water from its wings, and flew toward the hospital lights in the distance. When Katie reached her apartment, the darkness swallowed her whole. She didn't turn on any lights. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the closet door across the room, knowing exactly what waited inside, the shadow box she'd buried beneath winter coats and old textbooks, the one her son had never been allowed to see, the one she'd sworn to herself she'd never open again. The rain continued outside her window, drumming against the glass like Morse code, like Helmand Province mortar fire, like the sound of a life she'd spent 2 decades pretending didn't exist. The apartment smelled of stale coffee and something else, fear, maybe. Or regret. They smelled the same to her now. She stood. Her knees cracked. She opened the closet door and pushed aside the hanging clothes, her hand steady despite everything, muscle memory from a different era moving her body through its practiced motions. The shadow box sat in the darkness where she'd left it 8 years ago, black leather with brass corners, no larger than a showbox, heavy as the truth she'd been running from. She pulled it down and held it in her lap. Rain pressed against the window like fingertips asking to be let in. Inside the shadow box lay the medals in their crimson ribbons, each one a name of a mission she'd spent years forgetting. A bronze star with a small Vela device attached, the V signifying combat heroism under fire. Then a second bronze star with Vela. Then a third. Katie's hands trembled as she traced the geometry of each medal, not trembling from fear, but from the effort of holding back something vast and dangerous that lived in her chest, something that had learned how to survive in a country where survival meant becoming someone else entirely. Beneath the bronze stars lay a purple heart, its profile of George Washington facing left like a man looking back at what he'd lost. 2 more medals lay wrapped in tissue, awards she'd never worn in public, decorations for operations that didn't officially exist. And dog tags. Her dog tags, stamped with a name and service number she hadn't spoken aloud in 20 years. She closed the box. That night, Katie didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with the shadow box in front of her like a confession that needed a witness, like evidence of a crime she'd been trying to forget. The clock on the wall showed 2:41 a.m. when she finally stood and opened the refrigerator, not for food, but for the motion of standing, of doing something, of becoming human again instead of whatever she'd been pretending to be. The apartment was so quiet she could hear the fluorescent hum of the refrigerator's compressor, a sound that reminded her of the generator at Camp Shank, Loga Province, where she'd spent 6 months teaching a war orphan to stop flinching at sudden noises. That orphan was now a grown man in room 312, his oxygen levels dropping every hour that she wasn't there to monitor them. Sterling's written warning had been posted on the unit board at 1:15 p.m., and by lunch, the break room cleared within seconds of her sitting down. Nurses abandoned half-eaten sandwiches. No one would meet her eyes. Even Margaret, who'd been her closest colleague for 3 years, had turned away. The isolation was complete and intentional. But Katie had known worse silence, the kind that came before IEDs detonated, the kind that meant someone was about to die without a witness. She could survive institutional ostracism. She couldn't survive walking away from a second rescue that needed her hands. At 5:33 a.m., Katie's shift at Oak Creek Memorial would begin. She showered in water so hot it burned, watching steam rise like a physical manifestation of decision. She dressed in fresh scrubs, tucked her badge around her neck, and reviewed in her mind the tactical sign language she'd learned in Helmand Province when communicating with local civilians meant the difference between intelligence and an ambush. The signs came back to her like a language she'd spoken in dreams, hand shapes, positions, movements that her fingers could still perform even after 2 decades of disuse. Combat sign language was economical. Direct. No wasted motion. No room for misinterpretation. She could use it to check his pupils, explain procedures, ask about pain levels, all without sound, all without the 7 doctors who'd refused him seeing what she was doing. Sterling would erupt. She knew this. He would make calls to his attorney, to board members, to anyone who could help him protect the institutional hierarchy that had made him untouchable for 17 years. Katie understood institutional power the way a surgeon understands anatomy. She'd watched it work from the lowest position possible, completely invisible. But invisibility had its advantages. It meant no one was watching her closely enough to see her actually working. It meant the family in room 312 would be grateful enough to stay quiet. It meant 48 hours might be all she needed before everything collapsed anyway. Katie sat in her car in the parking lot of Oak Creek Memorial and waited for 5:33 a.m. to arrive, watching the sky transition from black to charcoal to a gray that promised rain. The worn combat boots sat on the passenger seat, the veteran's boots, the ones he'd left beside his bed like a prayer or a promise, and she'd moved them to safety in her locker, knowing that Sterling would destroy anything that humanized the patient in his mind. The boots smelled like desert dust and sweat and the peculiar aroma of operations that had never been officially sanctioned. She'd carried these boots in her mind for 20 years, the boy wearing them through rubble, the man beside her on extraction helicopters, the SEAL who'd made it home against the odds that should have stopped him. At 5:33 a.m. exactly, Katie Morrison stepped through the automatic doors of Oak Creek Memorial. The night shift was winding down. The morning crew hadn't yet arrived in force. The hallways were quiet, that particular 5 a.m. quiet that existed in hospitals everywhere, a holding pattern between the dying of night and the chaos of dawn. She'd treated 7 doctors' refusals with the same composure she'd use for a blood pressure reading, clinical observation, no judgment, no option for negotiation. 7 men and 1 woman saying no, stepping back from complexity, choosing the clean lines of institutional protection over the messy reality of a human being gasping for air. But Katie was the 8th option. She'd come through the Helmand Province alive. She'd carried a boy from rubble and taught him to survive in a language that transcended words. She'd buried her medals in a closet like contraband, and now they were calling her back, not with glory, but with necessity. The tactical sign language rose from her muscle memory like a second language she'd never actually forgotten, just suppressed. Rain began to fall on the parking lot. It would continue falling for the next 48 hours, as if the sky had decided to bear witness to what Katie was about to do. She walked toward room 312, her uniform crisp, her composure absolute, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already survived the worst this world could offer. The patient's vitals were deteriorating. She could see it on the monitor from the hallway, oxygen saturation sliding toward dangerous territory, heart rate climbing, the small signs that cascaded into emergency. Katie checked the chart. Noted the absence of any of the 7 physicians who'd already decided he didn't matter enough to save. And that was the moment everything changed, the moment she stopped being invisible. She opened the door to room 312 and stepped inside. The family turned to look at her. The patient's eyes found hers. And without speaking a single word, she began to speak in a language made of hands and precision and the absolute authority of someone who'd spent 2 decades waiting for permission to be herself. The first 48 hours felt like moving through water. Katie checked the veteran's vitals every 2 hours, her hand steady as she documented oxygen saturation, heart rate, respiratory effort. 94%. 93. 91. The decline was subtle enough that the day's shift might have missed it, but Katie wasn't missing anything anymore. Not this time. Not him. She communicated through the language of her hands, tactical sign language learned in Helmand Province, the same grammar she'd used to teach a frightened boy that survival required precision and faith. Her fingers moved with deliberate clarity. Water. Pain level. Breathing easier? The veteran's responses came slower than his movements should allow, but his eyes held understanding. Recognition. She saw it in the way he watched her hands, the way his shoulders relaxed when she entered the room instead of tensing as he had with every other staff member. By hour 36, the respiratory trend had become concerning. 89% oxygen saturation. His breathing had taken on a shallow quality, each inhalation fighting against something invisible. Katie pulled his chart, cross-referenced his last imaging, and found the note she'd been dreading, chest X-ray ordered but not yet completed. The hospital was running behind. The radiology tech was on break. The standard delays that meant nothing to healthy patients meant everything to a man whose lungs were already struggling. She documented everything. Respiratory rate elevated at 22. Work of breathing increased. Accessory muscle use starting to show. The warning signs were there if anyone was looking. Katie was looking. She'd spent 2 decades in operating theaters and field hospitals where looking was the difference between life and the kind of death that follows you forever. She sat at the bedside for another hour, watching the rhythm of his chest, listening to the ragged hiss of air moving through lungs that were working too hard. The morning of hour 48 arrived grey and cold. Rain hammered against the windows of room 312 like fists demanding entry. Katie arrived at 6 in the morning, 2 hours before her shift officially started, because she'd learned long ago that the most dangerous moments come in the margins between scheduled observations. She found the veteran's wife asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still wrapped around his fingers. Katie checked his oxygen. 87% and dropping. She checked his respiratory rate. 28 now. His chest was working like a man climbing a mountain with his mouth taped shut. She adjusted his position, elevated the head of the bed another 15 degrees, reviewed his medications for anything that might be suppressing his respiratory drive. Nothing obvious. She squeezed his hand and signed, "Need to watch you close today." His eyes acknowledged the message. He was scared. She could see it in the way his pupils had dilated, in the fine tension running through his shoulders. But that wasn't the worst part. The routine dressing change was scheduled for 9 o'clock. The surgeon's resident arrived with supplies, moving through the procedure with the kind of mechanical precision that came from having done it 500 times. Katie stood nearby, monitoring, watching. The resident began unwrapping the bandages, exposing the healing wound, and that's when everything changed. The veteran's chest went rigid. Not tense. Not tight. Rigid. The kind of sudden, complete immobility that meant something fundamental had broken inside his thoracic cavity. Katie's eyes moved to the monitor. His oxygen saturation was already at 78% and plummeting. 65. 58. The ventilation defect was catastrophic. His trachea was deviating, she could see the subtle shift in his neck positioning, the larynx being pushed away from midline by something expanding inside his chest with the pressure of a collapsing building. Tension pneumothorax. The words didn't come as a diagnosis. They came as muscle memory. Her hands were already moving, muscle fibers firing through pathways carved 2 decades ago in trauma bays where the margin between action and analysis was measured in seconds. The resident was frozen, his eyes locked on the monitor's cascade of red numbers. The patient's wife was standing now, her mouth open, no sound emerging. Oxygen saturation at 48%. Katie was already at the bedside, gloved hands moving like she'd rehearsed this moment every day of the past 20 years because in some way, she had. She palpated the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She felt for the anatomical landmarks with her fingertips, the precision of someone who'd done this in darkness, in sand, under the percussion of incoming fire. She had a 14-gauge angiocath needle in her hand. Where it came from, whether she'd grabbed it or someone had placed it there, didn't matter. The procedural world had narrowed to a single point of focus. She inserted the needle. The hiss of air escaping the pleural space filled room 312 like a valve releasing pressure from a bomb. The sound was mechanical and alive at once, the noise of a man's lungs suddenly finding room to expand again. She advanced the catheter, removed the needle, taped the hub in place. 60% oxygen saturation. 70. 82. The monitor's red numbers turned orange, then yellow. 89. 94. Sinus rhythm steady on the screen. His wife was crying, her hands covering her mouth, and the veteran's eyes were locked on Katie's with an expression that transcended language. The crash cart arrived 45 seconds later. The attending physician stood in the doorway, taking in the scene, the catheter taped to the patient's chest, the normal vital signs on the monitor, the veteran's wife holding his hand, Katie standing with her hand still extended in the posture of someone who'd just put a life back together. The attending's jaw tightened. Before anyone could speak, before anyone could even begin to process what had just happened, the surgeon's resident said quietly, "She saved his life." That was a needle decompression. Perfect technique. 30 seconds faster than we could have done it. The attending nodded slowly and left without speaking. But that wasn't the worst part either. 3 minutes later, Dr. Sterling emerged from his office, and he was not alone. 2 board members flanked him like sentries. A hospital attorney followed, carrying a leather folder. They moved through the hallway with the coordinated precision of people who'd planned this moment with surgical care. Sterling's face was composed, almost serene, the expression of a man who'd been preparing his counterattack since the moment Katie had defied his order. He entered room 312 without knocking. "Nurse Morrison." His voice was ice in a business suit. "Step outside, please." Katie followed him into the corridor. The 2 board members positioned themselves beside her like geometry proving a mathematical point about power and powerlessness. The attorney opened his folder. Sterling's words came measured and deliberate. "You performed a needle decompression. A procedure that is restricted to physicians and certified advanced practitioners. You have no authorization, no credentials, no scope of practice that permits what you just did." He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. "You've endangered this hospital's accreditation. You've exposed Oak Creek Memorial to liability. You've acted recklessly and outside the bounds of nursing practice, and that cannot be tolerated." One of the board members cleared his throat. "Your employment is terminated immediately. Pending investigation." Katie said nothing. Her composure was the silence of someone who'd already calculated the cost and decided it was worth paying. She removed her badge from her pocket and set it on the counter of the nurse's station. The plastic was warm from her body. For a moment, no one moved. Sterling was already on his phone, dialing extension codes, his voice carrying into the corridor. "Yes, I need to speak with the state nursing board. Yes, immediately. We have a situation involving an authorized medical practice." He turned away, his voice dropping, his hands already building the architecture of Katie's professional destruction. That evening, Katie stood at the grave of Marcus Sr., her late husband, in Norfolk Memorial Cemetery. Rain fell in sheets, the kind of rain that came from a sky that had decided to empty itself completely. She was still wearing her scrubs, damp now, clinging to her skin like a second layer of shame that didn't belong to her but that she carried anyway because that was what she did. She carried things. She knelt in the mud beside his headstone. The granite was slick with water, cold under her palms. "I failed again, Marcus," she whispered. Her voice cracked, and she didn't try to stop it because no one was listening. The rain was loud enough. "I saved him twice. Once in Helmand when he was a boy, once today when his lungs forgot how to work. And they're making me walk away. I couldn't save you, and now I can't even save myself." She stayed there until the cemetery lights came on, automatic and indifferent, illuminating rows of people who'd already finished their stories. Inside Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Sterling was still working. Still building. Still making calls. He'd contacted Katie's references at the understaffed clinic where she'd worked before Norfolk, pressuring them to recall performance issues that didn't exist, that he was fabricating with the casual certainty of someone who'd never been told no by an institution that mattered. He'd brought in an outside risk management consultant, a woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in defending hospitals against allegations of inadequate supervision. Together, they were constructing a narrative that would make Katie's termination look inevitable. By midnight, Sterling had scheduled her formal hearing for Friday at 2 o'clock. He drafted a press release about maintaining hospital standards and protecting patient safety. He documented her defiance, her insubordination, her reckless disregard for chain of command. He'd won. Or he believed he had. The difference would become clear within 48 hours. But Katie didn't know that yet. She was still kneeling in the rain, her hands on a grave, her life disassembling in real time around her. The hospital conference room fell silent when the doors burst open. Dr. Sterling entered first, his jaw set like hardened concrete, followed by two board members in charcoal suits and a hospital attorney whose briefcase clicked against the polished table. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone overhead. Katie stood motionless, her hand still smelling of antiseptic and the ocean salt scent of sweat from 36 hours without sleep. She didn't flinch. She never flinched anymore. Immediate suspension pending investigation for practicing outside your scope, Sterling announced, his voice filling the room like a tank idling in a garage. The attorney slid a folder across the table. Katie didn't touch it. The words were already written on her face, had been written there since the moment she'd pushed that needle between the veteran's ribs and felt the hiss of pressure release. She'd known this was coming. She'd made peace with it at Marcus's grave. But Sterling wasn't finished. He'd spent the last 48 hours building his case with the precision of someone whose entire life depended on winning. He'd called Katie's previous employer, the understaffed clinic where she'd worked before Oak Creek Memorial, where she'd kept her head down and her past buried. He'd pressured them with questions designed to excavate performance issues that didn't exist. The clinic director, a nervous man named Hoffman, had caved immediately under Sterling's institutional weight, suddenly remembering Katie as unreliable and difficult to manage, words that hung in the air like poison gas. "We've also discovered discrepancies in your personnel file," Sterling continued, his fingers steepled like a man holding all the cards. An outside risk management consultant had been brought in, a woman named Caldwell who specialized in building termination cases so airtight they could withstand legal challenge. She'd combed through 7 years of Katie's employment records, looking for ammunition. When she couldn't find enough, she and Sterling had manufactured it. 17 incident reports, backdated to create a false pattern of incompetence. Performance reviews altered with timestamps changed from 2023 to 2019. A fabricated complaint from a surgeon Katie had never worked with. The database entries glowed on Sterling's laptop screen like evidence of a crime that had never happened. Katie felt the weight of institutional power pressing down like a physical force. This was how hospitals worked when you challenged the hierarchy. This was the price of defiance. Sterling leaned forward, and his voice dropped to something that sounded almost like pleasure. "You don't belong here. You never did." The attorney explained the terms. Immediate suspension. Pending investigation. Likely termination. Her nursing license would be reviewed by the state board based on the fabricated evidence. The clinic would receive a certified letter requesting additional details about her performance history. Every door that had been opened would be systematically closed. Sterling had weaponized the entire institutional apparatus, not because Katie had done anything wrong, but because she'd made him look weak in front of a patient and his family. Power isn't about being right. Power is about making sure no one remembers the moment you were wrong. Katie stood to leave. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. That kind of desperation was what Sterling wanted, proof that she was breaking, that his machinery was working. She simply gathered the folder, held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and moved toward the door. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. The attorney cleared his throat. Sterling's jaw tightened because her quiet refusal to shatter was somehow more threatening than any word she could have spoken. The hallway outside was empty. Her badge clattered against the tile floor as she unclipped it. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the sterile corridor. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, on a Thursday morning that started like any other, an FBI agent walked into Sterling's office without knocking. She was tall, with the kind of bearing that suggested she'd seen worse than anything a hospital could produce. Behind her came two more agents in dark windbreakers. Sterling's attorney had already called. The FBI had been contacted by the State Medical Board, which had flagged the altered timestamps in Katie's personnel database during a routine audit. 17 fabricated incident reports. Performance reviews with metadata that proved they'd been modified 3 months after they were supposedly written. The consultant Caldwell had used hospital software to backdate documents, leaving a digital trail that any forensic analyst could follow in 30 minutes. Dr. Richard Sterling, the agent said, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand. You're under investigation for fraud, document falsification, and obstruction of medical practice. You have the right to remain silent. The handcuffs were steel, professional, and utterly final. Sterling's face drained of color because he believed his own mythology, that his position, his credentials, his connections made him untouchable. That power was permanent. That the hospital would protect its own. They didn't know who they were standing next to. That was the phrase Katie would later understand. They didn't know that Katie Morrison had spent 12 years in special forces, had extracted wounded soldiers from burning buildings under fire, had trained herself to survive on nothing but nerve and muscle memory. They didn't know that the careful invisibility she'd constructed was both a shield and a weapon. But more importantly, Sterling didn't know that the veteran he'd refused to help, the man whose life Katie had saved with a needle decompression, had contacts in 3-letter agencies who'd been monitoring the situation since his arrival at Oak Creek Memorial. The perp walk happened at 10:02 a.m. on a Friday. Sterling's suit was wrinkled. His tie hung at an angle. 2 agents held his arms as they guided him through the hospital lobby, past the same staff who'd abandoned Katie at lunch, past the same coffee station where he'd announced her suspension to the break room crowd. Camera flashes exploded. Local news vans crowded the parking lot. The Norfolk Ledger, the NBC affiliate, every local outlet had the story, hospital doctor charged with fraud in retaliation against nurse. By noon, Sterling's attorney had advised him to resign before formal charges were filed. The hospital administrator, faced with the nightmare of a lawsuit and federal investigation, terminated his employment within 4 hours. His medical license was immediately flagged for review by the Virginia State Board of Medicine. The forged documents were entered into evidence. The consultant Caldwell, recognizing the ship was sinking, immediately cooperated with investigators and testified that Sterling had directed her to fabricate the reports. A plea deal materialized within weeks. Sterling would plead guilty to fraud and evidence tampering. No jail time, his attorney had negotiated that carefully, but permanent loss of medical license, 500 hours of community service, and $23,000 in restitution to Katie Morrison. The hospital would settle her suspension and issue a formal apology. The altered records would be expunged from every database. His wife filed for divorce 2 weeks later. She took the house in Virginia Beach, the investment accounts, and the anger of 2 decades finally unleashed. The country club membership was revoked without comment. Former colleagues stopped returning his calls. Job applications to other hospitals were processed with a simple notation in his file, terminated for cause. Criminal investigation ongoing. The flag in the medical database ensured that no respectable facility would touch him. 3 months after his arrest, Sterling received a single job offer. Norfolk Community College needed an instructor for their CPR certification program. $15 an hour. Basement classroom with peeling paint. A plastic dummy named Annie for demonstrating chest compressions to students half his age who had no idea who he was or what he'd been. He taught them the same techniques he'd refused to use on a deaf patient, the same procedures that Katie had performed under fire, literally and figuratively. On the evening Katie's face appeared on national television accepting the National Nursing Excellence Award, Sterling stood in his studio apartment and watched the ceremony on YouTube. She wore her dress blues for the first time in 2 decades. Her medals displayed on her chest. Her son Marcus beside her in a suit, his face shining with pride. The deaf veteran sat in the front row holding a pair of worn combat boots, the same boots that had started everything, that had survived more firefights than Sterling had seen patients. Katie's voice carried across the screen. This is about institutions prioritizing patient care over hierarchy. This is about refusing to be complicit when systems fail. This is about the people we serve, not the power we protect. The hospital renames the emergency wing after her. The governor issued a proclamation. Sterling's phone buzzed with the news alert. He watched the ceremony until the end, until Katie accepted her award with the quiet dignity of someone who'd already sacrificed everything that mattered. Then he turned off the video and sat in the dark of his apartment, the Italian loafers replaced with discount sneakers, the expensive cologne gone, every hierarchy he'd ever depended on dismantled by his own desperation to maintain it. The next morning, he taught CPR to 17 teenagers in a basement classroom. None of them knew his name. If you've watched this far, you already know the answer. Heroes walk among us, and they're often the people we judge first and understand last. Katie Morrison's story became a national watershed moment, not because of her medals or her military past, but because she refused to compromise her oath when the system told her to look away. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who carry invisible burdens. Like this video if you believe institutions should prioritize patients over power. And comment, what would you have done in Sterling's position? Would you have doubled down, or would you have stepped back? The answer reveals everything about who we are.